I built him up. I held his hand when the world ignored him. I wiped away his tears when he failed, and I pushed him forward when he wanted to give up. He had nothing when I met him. No money, no status, no confidence. But I saw something in him. I believed in him when no one else did. I sacrificed my time, my energy, my own dreams, just so he could chase his. While others laughed at him, I stood beside him. While he doubted himself, I reminded him of his worth. I told him he was meant for greatness, that one day he would be a king. And I made sure he got there. He had big dreams, but empty pockets. There were nights he wanted to quit because no one would give him a chance. But I didn't let him. I stayed up with him, helping him prepare, pushing him to keep going. I worked extra hours, saved every penny, and made sure he never had to worry about anything. When he couldn't afford the right clothes for his meetings, I bought them for him. When he couldn't pay rent, I covered it. I wrote his speeches, connected him with the right people, and made sure his name was heard. Every step he took forward had my efforts behind it, but I never asked for anything in return. I thought love was enough. He promised me everything. He told me I was his world, that we would stand together when he finally made it. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I had given him everything I had. He looked me in the eyes and said I was the only one he needed, that he would never forget what I did for him. I held onto those words like a lifeline, never questioning, never doubting. I was so sure that once he reached the top, he would pull me up with him. And then everything changed. I built him up from nothing. I gave him my time, my love, my strength, everything I had. He had no future, no name, no power, but I believed in him when no one else did. I held him up when he was too weak to stand. And when the world turned its back on him, I stood by his side. I thought that meant something. I thought I meant something. He used to tell me I was his reason for fighting, that every step he took, every battle he won, was because of me. He looked at me like I was his everything, like I was the only one who truly saw him. And I did. I saw the man he could become before he even saw it himself. I pushed him forward, made sacrifices he never even noticed, and poured my soul into making his dreams come true. Then, one day, everything was different. His words weren't as warm. His eyes didn't shine when he looked at me. The late nights became longer. The unanswered calls became normal. The excuses, the distance, the quiet moments, filled with something unspoken. It all crept in slowly, so silently, that I didn't even realize I was losing him until it was too late. I told myself it was stress, that he was just busy, that things would go back to how they were. But deep down, something inside me whispered the truth. Something had changed, and soon I would find out why. I ignored the signs at first. I told myself that love didn't just disappear overnight, that the man who once held me like I was his entire world couldn't suddenly forget the woman who stood by him through everything. I convinced myself that he was just overwhelmed, that success came with responsibilities, that he needed space to adjust to the life he had always dreamed of. But dreams weren't supposed to feel like nightmares. The late nights turned into forgotten plans. He stopped calling me before bed. The good morning texts that once made me feel like the first thought in his mind were replaced by silence. When I asked if something was wrong, he smiled, kissed my forehead, and told me I was overthinking. But I knew better. His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. His touch felt like an afterthought. And worst of all, I could feel it. He was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to hold on. Then, the lies started. Small at first. A dinner meeting that ran late. A last-minute trip he forgot to mention. A phone call he had to step outside for. voice low, gaze darting away, when I asked who it was. I told myself I trusted him. I told myself I had no reason to doubt the man who once swore he'd give me the world. But trust isn't blind. It sees the cracks even when the heart wants to pretend they don't exist. The truth didn't come all at once. It unraveled piece by piece, like a thread slowly pulled from a carefully woven fabric. The first time I saw her name, I felt a shift in my stomach, an unease I couldn't explain. He had never mentioned her before, yet there it was, her name flashing across his phone screen while he was in the shower. My heart pounded as I stared at it, my fingers twitching, 1,000 thoughts rushing through my mind. I could have ignored it. I could have pretended I didn't see, but something inside me wouldn't let go. I waited for him to say her name, to mention her in passing, to give me a reason, any reason, to believe that she was just another person in his new world. But he never did. Instead, I watched as he became someone I didn't recognize. His laughter was different when he thought I wasn't listening. His phone was always face down. The man who once couldn't go a day without telling me how much I meant to him now barely looked me in the eyes. And then, one night, the last thread snapped. He had promised me dinner. A night just for us, like old times. I dressed up, spent hours trying to look perfect, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong about everything, that he would take my hands, look at me the way he used to, and I would feel like home again. But he never showed up. The food got cold. My calls went unanswered. And as I sat there, staring at my untouched plate, my phone buzzed with a message I was never meant to see. A picture, him, in a restaurant across town, smiling, with her, the world around me blurred. My hands turned cold as I stared at the picture on my screen, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. He wasn't just with her, he was happy. His smile wasn't forced, his posture wasn't stiff. He looked comfortable, at ease, like he belonged there. The same man who had once told me I was his home now sat across from another woman, looking at her the way he used to look at me. I tried to breathe, but the air felt too heavy. My fingers tightened around my phone as my mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe it was business. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew. I had known for a long time, but I had refused to accept it. And now, the truth was staring back at me through a glowing screen, cruel and undeniable. I called him. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. The longer the silence stretched, the clearer everything became. He wasn't just drifting away. He had already left. I had just been too blind to see it. When he finally called back hours later, his voice was calm, smooth, as if nothing had happened. "Sorry, I got caught up," he said, his tone laced with practiced ease. I waited, giving him the chance to tell me. To be honest, to say something, anything, that didn't feel like another lie. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. There was a pause, a second too long. And then he sighed. "Just out. Work stuff. You know how it is. Work stuff." He still thought I was a fool. I wanted to scream, to throw the truth in his face, to ask how long he had been feeding me these lies. But instead, I swallowed my pain, forced my voice to stay even. "I saw you," I whispered. "I saw the picture." Silence, a different kind this time, heavy, tense, and then the shift. He exhaled sharply, frustration seeping into his words. "It's not what you think." The oldest excuse in the book, the words of a man who had already chosen his betrayal but wasn't ready to face its consequences. I should have broken then. I should have let my heart shatter, should have begged for an answer that would make the pain go away. But something inside me hardened. A part of me that had been ignored for too long finally woke up, and for the first time, I saw him clearly. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. And he had made it long before I ever realized. A cold wave washed over me as I stood there, gripping my phone like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. I had spent years believing in him, trusting him, fighting for him. And yet, in this moment, I was nothing more than an obstacle he had already stepped over. He didn't panic. He didn't apologize. He just sighed, as if my pain was an inconvenience, as if I was being dramatic for reacting to the truth he never had the courage to admit. "It's not what you think," he repeated, this time with more frustration than guilt. I let out a quiet breath, steadying myself. "Then, tell me what it is." He didn't answer right away. He was thinking, calculating, trying to find the right words that would keep me from walking away. I had seen this side of him before, back when he was still struggling, still trying to make people believe in him. He had always been good with words, always knew how to spin the truth just enough to keep people on his side. I had admired that once, but now I hated it. "I've just been overwhelmed," he said finally, his voice softer, almost apologetic. "You know how things have been. I didn't want to stress you out. I should have told you sooner." "Told me what? That he had found someone better? That he had been seeing her behind my back while I stayed up at night waiting for him? That the man who once swore he couldn't live without me had already replaced me before I even realized I had been left behind?" My fingers curled into my palm, nails digging into my skin as I fought back the bitterness rising in my throat. "So, what is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just a friend? A business partner? Someone you accidentally took to a candlelit dinner?" The sharp inhale on the other end told me he hadn't expected that. He had expected me to cry, to break down, to beg him to tell me it wasn't true. But I had no more tears left for him. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something real in his voice. Guilt, regret, but not enough to change anything. I let out a bitter laugh. But it did. Another silence. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of every moment I had spent believing in a love that had never truly belonged to me. The missed calls, the excuses, the slow detachment. It had all been leading to this, and I had let it happen. I had convinced myself that if I just held on a little longer, if I just loved him a little harder, he would come back to me. But love doesn't work like that. Love isn't something you have to beg for, and I refused to beg any longer. "I won't do this," I said, my voice firm. "I won't fight for something that's already gone." He said my name then, softly, like he had just realized he was losing me. Maybe, in his mind, I would always be there, waiting, no matter how many times he pushed me aside. Maybe he thought I would swallow my pride, forgive him like I had forgiven every little thing before. But this wasn't something that could be undone. "I really didn't want to hurt you," he murmured, as if that changed anything. But he had, and the worst part, he hadn't even cared enough to stop himself from doing it. I didn't say another word. I didn't argue or scream or demand answers that no longer mattered. I just ended the call and placed my phone on the table, staring at it for a long moment. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind, memories of us, of everything we had been, of everything I had given him. And for what? To be thrown away like I was just another chapter in his story. No, but that wasn't how this was going to end. He thought he had won. He thought I would be the one left broken, watching him from the shadows while he moved on with his perfect new life. But he didn't realize something. I had spent years building him up, teaching him how to survive, making sure he became someone the world couldn't ignore. But in doing that, I had forgotten something important. I wasn't just his support. I wasn't just the woman behind his success. I was the reason he had even gotten there in the first place. And now, it was my turn to rise. The pain didn't leave overnight. It sat in my chest, heavy and unforgiving, pressing against every memory I had of him. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand why I wasn't enough. But deep down, I already knew the answer. It had nothing to do with me. Some people will take everything you give and still look for more. Some people will build their castles with the stones you carried for them and then leave you standing in the dirt, forgotten. But I refused to be forgotten. For days, I let myself feel the weight of what had happened. I let myself break. I let myself cry until there was nothing left. But then, something inside me shifted. The sadness turned into something else. Something sharper, stronger. A quiet, burning rage, not just at him, but at myself. At the girl who had sacrificed so much for someone who had never truly seen her. At the woman who had poured all her love into building someone else's kingdom while letting her own dreams collect dust. That was the last day I allowed myself to be weak. I wiped my tears and stood up, staring at the reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. She looked tired, hollow, like someone who had spent too long believing in a love that was never meant to last. But underneath the exhaustion, there was something else. A fire, a promise. He had built his success on my support, my encouragement, my sacrifices. He had stepped into the light while I stayed in the shadows. But if he thought I would disappear, that I would crumble in his absence, he was wrong. I started with the little things. I stopped waiting for his messages. I stopped checking my phone, stopped hoping for an apology that would never come. Instead, I poured myself into the things I had abandoned for him. The career I had put on hold, the passions I had set aside, the dreams I had once whispered to him in the dark, believing we would chase them together. Only now I would chase them alone. The first step was the hardest, choosing myself for the first time in years. But with every passing day, it became easier. My mind became clearer. The weight in my chest slowly lifted. And then something unexpected happened. People started noticing me. The same people who once only saw him now turned their heads when I walked into a room. The connections I had made for him, the doors I had opened for his career, they were still there, waiting for someone strong enough to walk through them. And I was ready. I worked harder than ever. I built myself up the way I had once built him, only this time every step forward was mine alone. No more waiting in the background, no more giving away my power for the sake of someone else's success. I had spent too long being the woman behind the man. Now, I would be the woman standing in front of the world. And the best part? I didn't need him to get there. Months passed, and the whispers started. His name was still everywhere, but now, so was mine. He had crowned another queen, but the kingdom he once ruled didn't just belong to him anymore. I had carved my own place, taken my own throne, and for the first time, I didn't look back. Not until the day he did. It started subtly. A name mentioned in passing, a lingering glance at an event, a mutual friend slipping a comment into conversation. At first I ignored it. I had spent too much time trying to erase him from my thoughts to let him slip back in now. But the signs were everywhere. He was watching me. I didn't need to look to know it. I could feel it, the weight of his regret creeping back into my world like an unwelcome ghost. The man who once walked away so easily, now stood at the edges of my success, realizing too late what he had lost. I should have felt satisfaction. I should have smiled, knowing that the tables had turned. But instead, all I felt was indifference. That was the true victory. Not that he missed me, not that he saw what I had become, but that I no longer cared. And yet, fate had a way of bringing unfinished stories to the surface. It happened on a night that should have been perfect, a night that had nothing to do with him. I had been invited to a prestigious event, the kind of gathering where powerful people moved, where reputations were built and futures were shaped. I walked in with confidence, head held high, my presence undeniable. The whispers followed me, just as they once had for him. And then I saw him. He stood across the room, surrounded by familiar faces, wearing the same charming smile that once made my heart race. But this time, it didn't. This time, I saw past it. The way his shoulders tensed when our eyes met. The flicker of something in his gaze. Regret, uncertainty, longing. He wasn't the same man who had walked away from me. Something had changed. He moved toward me, hesitant at first, like he wasn't sure if he had the right. The people around us blurred into the background, the air between us thick with unspoken words. And then, finally, he spoke. "You look incredible." I let the words settle, measuring them, not because I needed his validation, but because I wanted him to feel the weight of his own mistake. He had spent so long believing I was just another piece in his story, something he could set aside and return to when it was convenient. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I gave him a polite smile, the kind you give to a stranger. "I know." That startled him. His confidence wavered, and for the first time, I saw something unfamiliar in his expression. Nervousness, doubt, like he was realizing too late that I had truly moved on. "I wanted to reach out," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck, a habit I had once found endearing. I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me." A part of me wanted to laugh. The audacity of it. The man who had broken me, who had left me to piece myself back together, now stood before me, searching for an opening, hoping for a second chance. I tilted my head, studying him. "Why now?" His jaw tightened, his hands sliding into his pockets. "Because I made a mistake." Ah, there it was. The words I had once dreamed of hearing. The confession, the admission, the acknowledgement of everything I had suffered because of him. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. I nodded slowly. "You did." He blinked, as if he had expected something else. A sign of hope, an invitation to talk, maybe even forgiveness. But I wasn't here to ease his conscience. "She wasn't who I thought she was," he continued, and I almost rolled my eyes. Of course she wasn't. She never was, because women like her didn't build, they took. And now that she had taken everything she wanted, he was left with nothing. Nothing but the realization that he had let go of the one person who had truly cared for him. But that wasn't my problem. He sighed, his gaze searching mine. "I don't expect you to take me back. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. Everything you did for me. Everything I threw away." I let his words hang in the air. There was a time when I would have given anything to hear them. A time when I would have believed they meant something. But not now. Not after everything. I met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "I spent years fighting for you, believing in you, loving you." I took a small step closer, watching as he straightened, as if my presence alone still had a hold over him. "And you crowned another queen." His throat bobbed, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides. He knew what was coming, he could feel it. I leaned in just enough for him to hear the final words that sealed his fate. But now, the real queen doesn't need a king. And with that, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from someone. I was walking toward myself. I didn't rush out of the event. I didn't let my pace quicken or my hands tremble. I didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing that for even a second he had shaken me, because he hadn't. I wasn't the same woman he had left behind. The one who had waited by the phone, desperate for his attention. The one who had made excuses for his growing distance, who had held onto memories long after they had turned to dust. That version of me had died the moment I realized I was worth more than his half-hearted regrets. The air outside was crisp, the city lights stretching endlessly before me. Everything looked different now, sharper, clearer. For so long, my world had revolved around him. His success, his dreams, his love. But this was mine, my world, my future. I took a slow breath, steadying myself against the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. Not sadness, not anger, just a quiet, undeniable sense of power. He had looked at me like I was a ghost from his past, a reminder of something he had lost. But I wasn't a ghost. I was real. And for the first time, I belonged only to myself. The night should have ended there. I should have walked away, let the past dissolve into nothing, let him stew in his own misery. But life has a funny way of testing you, of making sure you've truly learned the lesson it tried to teach you. Because as I reached the steps, a voice called my name. I knew it was him before I turned around. I could feel it, that desperate pull, that final attempt to rewrite the ending of a story that was already finished. I exhaled slowly before facing him. He had followed me. He wasn't smiling now. His confidence was gone, replaced by something raw. He looked younger somehow, smaller. Like the man I had first met, back when he had nothing but dreams and an empty wallet. Back when I had given him everything I had, thinking he would do the same for me. What do you want? My voice was calm, emotionless. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I knew too well. He hesitated, eyes searching mine. I couldn't let you leave like that. I arched a brow. Like what? Like I meant nothing. I blinked. Of all the things he could have said, that was what he chose. That was what mattered to him. Not the way he had discarded me. Not the months I had spent picking up the pieces of my broken heart. Not the nights I had cried myself to sleep while he played house with another woman. But the fact that now, when he was finally ready to acknowledge what he had lost, I had already moved on. You want to mean something to me? I asked, tilting my head. Now. He sighed, stepping closer, but I didn't back away. I wasn't the one who had something to prove. He was. I was stupid, he admitted, voice quieter now. I thought I was making the right choice. I thought... He stopped himself, shaking his head. I don't know what I thought. I watched him, waiting. Not because I cared about his excuses, but because I wanted him to hear the words coming out of his own mouth. I wanted him to listen to how pathetic they sounded. She wasn't you, he continued after a beat. She never was. She never supported me the way you did. She never understood me like you did. His voice broke slightly, and for the first time, I saw it. The regret, deep and real, settling into his bones. I miss you. I let those words linger between us, heavy with meaning. Once they would have unravelled me. Once I would have given anything to hear them, to believe them. But now they meant nothing. Because the man standing before me wasn't the man I had loved. He was just a stranger wearing his face. A stranger who had thrown away something priceless and only realised it after it was too late. I smiled. not out of pity, not out of cruelty, but because, finally, I saw the truth. "I'm sure you do," I said simply. His expression faltered. He had expected a different response. Maybe a tearful reunion, maybe anger, maybe a fight, but indifference. That was something he wasn't prepared for. "I never wanted to hurt you," he tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. I nodded, thoughtful. "And yet, you did." His shoulders slumped, and for the first time since he had called my name, I saw the realization settle in. This wasn't a moment for redemption. This wasn't a love story waiting to be salvaged. This was his reckoning, his moment of understanding that some losses can't be undone. He had crowned another queen, and now the real queen was walking away. I turned away from him, my heels clicking against the pavement as I walked down the steps. The cold air wrapped around me, crisp and sharp, but I didn't shiver. I was numb in the best possible way, not from pain, not from sorrow, but from the finality of it all. The weight I had carried for so long, the grief, the regret, the longing, had been lifted. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hoping for a different ending. I wasn't waiting for him to realize my worth, because I'd already realized it myself. But he wasn't ready to let go. "Wait," he called, his voice breaking through the night air. I didn't stop. Not at first. I had nothing left to say to him, but something in the way he said it, the rawness of his tone, made me pause, just for a second. I turned slightly, not enough to face him fully, but enough to let him speak. "I know I don't deserve another chance." His words were quiet, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to say them. "But if I asked for one, would you consider it?" I let out a slow breath, my heart steady, my mind clearer than it had ever been. I had already made my decision long before he ever came crawling back, but part of me wanted him to hear it. I wanted him to feel it, to carry it with him the way I had carried the weight of his betrayal. So I turned to face him fully, my expression unreadable. If you'd asked me that a year ago, I wouldn't have even needed to think about it. I would have forgiven you. I would have let you back in, no matter how much it hurt. His face softened, as if for a moment he thought there was hope. I took a step closer, just enough to make sure he understood every word that came next. But the difference between then and now is that I finally know what I deserve. And it's not you. His breath hitched, his lips parting as if he wanted to argue, to fight for something he had already lost. But what could he say? There was no justification for what he had done, no excuse that could erase the nights I had spent wondering why I wasn't enough, no apology that could turn back time and undo the moment he had chosen someone else over me. I had been the woman who built him, who sacrificed for him, who stood beside him when no one else did. And in return, he had handed my crown to another. But I wasn't waiting for him to give it back. I had built my own throne. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his hands clenching at his sides. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I wish I could go back. I wish I could change it." I tilted my head slightly, considering his words. Then, with a small smile, I said, "I don't." And that was the difference between us. He wanted to go back, to erase his mistakes, to undo the consequences of his own choices. But me? I had no desire to return to a past where I had to fight for love, where I had to beg for loyalty, where I had to shrink myself just to make space for someone who never truly valued me. I had spent so long believing that I had lost something when he left, that he had taken something from me. But in this moment, watching him stand there, empty-handed and regretful, I realized the truth. I wasn't the one who had lost. He was. He had lost the woman who would have stood by his side forever, the woman who had given him everything, even when he had nothing, the woman who had loved him when he was unworthy of that love. And now, he had to live with that. I took one final look at him, memorizing the image of a man who had once been my whole world. Not because I missed him, but because I wanted to remember this feeling, this closure, this undeniable proof that I had survived without him. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away. This time, I didn't stop. This time, I didn't look back. As I walked away, the night air felt different, lighter, freer. Every step I took put more distance between us, not just physically, but in every possible way. The man I had once built my world around was now just a fading figure in the background, a shadow in a story that no longer belonged to him. And for the first time in a long time, I felt untouchable. I didn't rush. I didn't run. I simply moved forward, knowing that with every step I was leaving behind the last remnants of the past. He had called my name, tried to make me stop, but I didn't owe him another moment. He had stolen enough of my time already. I reached the street, the city lights glowing above me, cars passing by in a blur of movement. I could have hailed a cab, could have disappeared into the night without another thought of him, but something in me wanted to linger for just a moment longer. Not because I was holding on, but because I wanted to mark this night in my memory. This was the night I was truly free. I pulled out my phone, not to check for messages from him. I knew there would be none. He wouldn't text, not now. His pride wouldn't allow it, at least not yet. He would stew in his regret, sit with the weight of his mistakes, let them settle into his bones until they became part of him. And maybe, for the first time, he would understand what it felt like to be the one left behind. I scrolled through my notifications, smiling to myself at the messages waiting for me. People who valued me. People who had been reaching out, who wanted to celebrate with me, who had been watching as I built my own success. These were the people who mattered now. I lifted my gaze to the skyline, breathing in the crisp air. Everything I had done for him, all the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the belief that if I just loved him enough, he would always choose me. It was all in the past now. A lesson learned, a wound that had healed into something stronger than before. And just as I was about to move on, to step into the next chapter of my life, my phone vibrated in my hand. I glanced down, already knowing who it was before I even saw the name. Him. For a second, I debated whether to open it. He was probably still standing there, watching my retreating figure, unable to let go. Maybe he thought if he sent the right words, if he said what I had wanted to hear all those months ago, I would change my mind. I clicked on the message. I'm sorry. 2 words, simple. Too late. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. Not because I was amused, but because of how predictable it all was. The regret always came after the damage was done. The apologies always came when the person was already gone. I stared at the screen for a moment, considering my response. I could have ignored it. I could have let him sit in silence, left him wondering, left him to drown in the same uncertainty he had once put me through. But no, that wasn't who I was. I didn't need to be cruel to prove my strength. So I typed back one final message, not for him, but for myself. I forgave you a long time ago, but I don't need you anymore. And then, before he had the chance to reply, before he could twist my words into something they weren't, I did what I should have done a long time ago. I blocked his number. The moment I pressed that button, I felt it. True, undeniable closure. No lingering questions, No second thoughts. No more waiting for a different ending. I tucked my phone into my pocket and turned away from the past for good. Somewhere behind me, he was still standing there, staring at his screen, realizing that he had finally, truly lost me. But me? I was already walking towards something better. I walked forward, feeling lighter than I ever had before. The past no longer clung to me like a weight, no longer whispered doubts into my mind, no longer had the power to define me. He had once been my world, but I had built a new one where I was the center, where I no longer had to shrink myself to fit into someone else's dreams. For so long, I thought love meant sacrifice. I thought it meant giving and giving, even when I was running empty. I thought if I just loved hard enough, held on tight enough, I could make someone stay. But love isn't supposed to feel like a battle. It's not supposed to be something you beg for. I had spent years pouring into him, building him up, believing in him even when he didn't believe in himself. And in the end, he had walked away without a second thought, choosing someone else, thinking I would always be there in the background, waiting. But he had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated me. He thought I was nothing without him, but the truth was he had been nothing without me. And now, as I stepped into my own future, I realized something beautiful. I didn't need him. I never had. He had crowned another queen, thinking I would always be his backup plan. But while he was busy chasing a life that never truly fulfilled him, I had built something real. I had found my strength, my independence, my power. And now I wore my own crown, one that I had placed on my own head, without waiting for anyone else to do it for me. Somewhere out there, he would wake up every day knowing that he had let go of the one person who would have stood by him forever. He would watch as I continued to rise, as my name became greater than his, as I thrived in ways he never imagined. He would live with that regret, with that empty space where I once stood. But I would never think of him again, not with sadness, not with anger, not with longing, just with the simple, undeniable truth. He had lost me, and I had won. Thank you all for listening to this story with our channel. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe to motivate us to bring more interesting stories. Much love to all of you.